I want to thank everybody very much for coming tonight. Welcome to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. My name is Carl Laird. I'm with Students for a Democratic Society. SDS, along with the Muslim Students Association, Student Labor Action Coalition, and Students for Justice in Palestine, are privileged to welcome our speaker tonight. Norman G. Finkelstein is a political scientist who specializes on Jewish-related issues, particularly the Israel-Palestine conflict. As the situation in Israel and occupied Palestine have become more violent in the past few weeks, it is important to have an honest voice shed light on what is happening and how the conflict can be resolved. Dr. Finkelstein is the son of Holocaust survivors. Of the many values his parents instilled in him, they taught him the need to speak out against crimes when they are being committed in relative silence. He has held faculty positions at Brooklyn College, Rutgers University, Hunter College, New York University, and most recently DePaul University. Amidst considerable public debate, he was denied tenure at DePaul University in June 2007 and placed on administrative leave for the 2007-2008 academic year. On September 5, 2007, Dr. Finkelstein announced his resignation from DePaul. I had the pleasure a week ago today of talking to another champion of Palestinian rights, Professor Noam Chomsky. He has no shortage of praise for Finkelstein and his work, and explains regarding the tenure denial that Finkelstein had the support of his whole department and virtually everyone in his field. His tenure was turned down by the administration in contradiction to his faculty, after a vicious propaganda campaign mostly launched by a law professor at Harvard University, Alan Dershowitz. After attempting to prevent the publication of Finkelstein's most recent important book, Beyond Chutzpah, partially a rebuttal to Dershowitz's A Case for Israel, he resorted to outright slander. Dr. Chomsky explains that it's perfectly obvious why Dershowitz would resort to slander, because Finkelstein exposed him as being a liar, charlatan, and an apologist for Israeli atrocities. Aside from Beyond Chutzpah, Finkelstein has written 5 other books, including The Holocaust Industry and Image and Reality of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. After the lecture, there will be a question and answer period, and a book signing following that. Norman Finkelstein is one of the most prominent and controversial figures in American academia today, and he shows that intellectual rigor is a must in the pursuit of truth. I'm privileged to introduce you all tonight to Norman Finkelstein.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I don't think I've been to Milwaukee before. At least it doesn't seem familiar, this room. Have I been here? Marquette. That's in Milwaukee? Yeah, okay. I'm from Brooklyn. I know Manhattan and Queens. I was told that Wisconsin went overwhelmingly for Barack Obama, and whatever you think of Barack Obama, I think it's one of those cases where you can agree with Barack Obama's wife when she said that she's really proud to be an American now. And for those of us who lived through the pre-civil rights era, I really think it is a testament to the American people and how far we have traveled in coming to our senses and behaving like relatively decent human beings, at least to one another. The topic I want to talk about this evening is one that has more and more intrigued me in recent years. Namely, if you look at the documentary record on the Israel-Palestine conflict, namely the past or the historical record, the present, which basically means the human rights record, and the future, which basically means how do you resolve the conflict. If you look at the documentary record in the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's remarkably uncontroversial. There is a broad consensus on what the history shows. There's a broad consensus on what the human rights record shows, and there's a broad consensus on how to resolve the conflict. And yet, when you enter into the public arena, the arena of public debate, there's all of this controversy that swirls around the Israel-Palestine conflict. It seems so complicated. And the question I want to look at this evening is, how do you account for all of this controversy swirling around a conflict which, if you look at the actual record, it's remarkably uncomplicated? And the argument I'm going to make this evening is that most of the controversy swirling around the Israel-Palestine conflict, the vast preponderance of the controversy, it's conjured up, it's fabricated, it's artificial, it's fake. And the purpose of this fake controversy, this artificial controversy, is to divert people's attention from what the record shows and to divert people's attention from what the documentary record shows. Let me begin with a relatively straightforward, simple illustration of the argument I want to make tonight. In July 2004, the International Court of Justice, the highest judicial body in the world, it rendered a landmark advisory opinion on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Formally, the question it was asked to address, the General Assembly referred a question to the International Court. And the question was, is the wall that Israel is building in the occupied West Bank, is that wall legal under international law? What's the legal status of that wall? And the court eventually ruled that under international law, the wall is illegal, it has to be dismantled, the Palestinians have to be compensated for the damage already done. That's the better part, that's the part of the advisory opinion that's better known. But it's not actually, in my opinion at any rate, the most significant part of the advisory opinion. Because for the World Court to reach the decision that the wall was illegal, it had to answer a whole number of other legal questions. And it turns out that those legal questions it had to answer first are what are called the most controversial questions in the Israel-Palestine conflict. So those of you who are familiar with the lingo of the Israel-Palestine conflict, there's first of all this thing known as the peace process. Most of you have heard of it. And then within the peace process, there's this thing called the final status questions. How many people have heard of the final status questions? Okay, this is a relatively informed audience. Final status questions basically refers to those issues bearing on the Israel-Palestine conflict which are said to be so controversial that they have to be put off to the end of negotiations till the final status questions can be resolved. And those final status questions are typically said to be four. Those of you who are familiar with the topic, you can confirm whether or not what I'm saying is true. The four basic questions are usually said to be borders. What are the legitimate borders of the Israeli state, and what should be the borders of a future Palestinian state? Number two, the question of the settlements. What's the legal status of the settlements that Israel has built in the occupied territories. 3, the question of East Jerusalem. Under international law, to whom does East Jerusalem belong? And number 4, excuse me, and number 4, the question of the right of return of the Palestinian refugees. What rights do they have under international law? There used to be a 5th question, the question of water, but that's pretty much disappeared from the agenda. Now, of those 4 questions, borders, settlements, Jerusalem, and the right of return, it turns out that the International Court did decide on 3 of the 4 questions. For example, or in specific, number 1, the question of borders. The International Court said it's a tenet, that is, a fundamental principle of international law, that it's illegal to acquire territory by war. That in the modern world, you can't conquer territory by virtue of war. Israel conquered the West Bank and Gaza in the course of the June 1967 war. Therefore, under international law, it has no right to those territories. Those are not, as we're often told in the public arena, those are not disputed territories. Those are occupied Palestinian territories. Throughout the International Court's decision, it refers to occupied with a capital O, Palestinian with a capital P, and territories with a capital T. The occupied Palestinian territories. It refers, as the court says, to the whole of the West Bank and the whole of Gaza, because the whole of the West Bank and the whole of Gaza were conquered in the course of a war, and that's illegal under international law. Number 2, the question of the settlements. Under international law, in particular Article 49 of the 4th Geneva Convention, it's illegal for an occupying power to transfer its population to occupied territory. Therefore, said the court, the settlements, all of the settlements, are, in the words of the court, a flagrant violation of international law. They are not disputed settlements. They are a flagrant violation of international law. We turn to the 3rd question, the question of Jerusalem. We're often told that next to the refugee question, that's the most complicated one of all. And in fact, Israel claims East Jerusalem as part of its eternal and undivided capital, to use the official language. But not so, says the highest judicial body in the world. East Jerusalem was conquered in the course of the June 1967 war. That means it is not Israeli territory. Israel has no right to East Jerusalem. It's occupied Palestinian territory. If you read through the World Court decision, it refers to the West Bank, comma, including East Jerusalem, comma, and Gaza as occupied Palestinian territory. There is no dispute, there is no contention. It's as lucid as any phrase might be. Now, some of you might think, or an argument has been made, that the International Court of Justice, sometimes called the World Court,